Chapter 13. The green sign outside the church was lit with white lights. The words, St. Peter's Catholic Chaplaincy, University of Nigeria, seemed to twinkle as Amaka and I walked into the incense-scented church. I sat with her in the front pew, our thighs touching. We'd come alone. Auntie Efeoma had gone to the morning service with the others. St. Peter's didn't have the huge candles or the ornate marble altar of St. Agnes. The women didn't tie their scarves properly around their heads to cover as much hair as possible. I watched them as they came up for offertory. Some just draped see-through black veils over their hair. Others wore trousers, even jeans. Papa would be scandalized. A woman's hair must be covered in the house of God, and a woman must not wear a man's clothes, especially in the house of God, he would say. I imagined the plain wooden crucifix above the altar swinging back and forth as Father Amadi raised the host at consecration. His eyes were shut, and I knew that he was no longer behind the altar draped in white cotton, that he was somewhere else that only he and God knew about. He gave me communion, and when his finger grazed my tongue, I wanted to fall at his feet. But the thunderous singing from the choir propped me up and strengthened me to walk back to my seat. After we said the Lord's Prayer, Father Amadi didn't say, "Offer to each other the sign of peace." He broke into an Igbo song instead. Ekene neke odo, ezigbo nwanne, mnye makagi. The greeting of peace, my dear sister, dear brother, give me your hand. People clasped hands and hugged. Amaka hugged me, then turned to exchange brief hugs with the family seated behind. Father Amadi smiled right at me from the altar, his lips moving. I wasn't sure what he said, but I knew I would think about it over and over. I was still thinking about it, wondering what it was he had said, as he drove Amaka and me home after Mass. He told Amaka that he still hadn't received her confirmation name. He needed to get all the names together and have the chaplain look at them by the next day, Saturday. Amaka said she wasn't interested in choosing an English name, and Father Amadi laughed and said he would help her choose a name if she wanted. I looked out the window as we drove. There was no power, and so the campus looked as though a giant blue-black blanket had covered it. The streets we drove past were like tunnels, darkened by the hedges on each side. Gold-yellow lights of kerosene lamps flickered from behind windows and on verandas of homes, like the eyes of hundreds of wild cats. Auntie Efeoma was sitting on a stool on the veranda across from a friend of hers. Obiora was on the mat, seated between the two kerosene lamps. Both were turned low, filling the veranda with shadows. Amaka and I greeted Auntie Efeoma's friend, who wore a bright tie-dye boo-boo and her short hair natural. She smiled and said, "Kedu?" "Father Amadi said to greet you, Mum. He couldn't stay. He has people coming to see him at the chaplaincy house," Amaka said. She made to take one kerosene lamp. "Keep the lamp. Jaja and Chima have a lit candle inside. Close the door so the insects don't follow you in," Auntie Efeoma said. I pulled my scarf off and sat down next to Auntie Efeoma, watching the insects crowd around the lamps. There were many tiny beetles with something sticking out their backs as if they'd forgotten to tuck in their wings properly. They were not as active as the small yellow flies that sometimes flew away from the lamp and too close to my eyes. Auntie Ephema was recounting how the security agents had come to the flat. The dim light blurred her features. She paused often to add dramatic urgency to her story. And even though her friend kept saying, "Yini? Mesia?" What happened next? Auntie Ephema said, "Chelo nu." Wait, and took her time. Her friend was silent a long time after Auntie Ephema finished her story. The crickets seemed to take up the conversation then. Their loud shrilling seemed so close, although they well might have been miles away. "Did you hear what happened to Professor Okafor's son?" Auntie Ephema's friend finally asked. She spoke more Igbo than English, but all her English words came out with a consistent British accent, not like Papa's, which came on only when he was with white people, and sometimes skipped a few words, so that half a sentence sounded Nigerian and the other half British. "Which Okafor?" Auntie Ephema asked. "Okafor, who lives on Fulton Avenue. His son, Chidifu." "The one who is Obiora's friend?" "Yes, that one. He stole his father's exam papers and sold them to his father's students." "Ekusina? That small boy?" "Yes. Now that the university is closed, the students came to the house to harass the boy for the money. Of course, he had spent it. Okafor beat his son's front tooth out yesterday. Yet, this is the same Okafor who will not speak out about what's going wrong in this university, who will do anything to win favor with the big men in Abuja. He's the one who makes the list of lecturers who are disloyal. I hear he included my name, and yours." "I heard that too. Mana, what does it have to do with Chidifu?" "Do you try to treat cancer sores, or the cancer itself? We cannot afford to give pocket money to our children. We cannot afford to eat meat. We cannot afford bread. So, your child steals, and you turn to him in surprise? You must try to heal the cancer, because the sores will keep coming back." "Mba, Chiaku, you cannot justify theft." "I do not justify it. What I'm saying is that Okafor shouldn't be surprised, and shouldn't waste his energy breaking a stick on his poor son's body. It's what happens when you sit back and do nothing about tyranny. Your child becomes what you cannot recognize." Auntie Ephema sighed heavily and looked at Obiora, perhaps wondering if he too could turn into something she wouldn't recognize. "I talked to Philippa the other day," she said. "Oh, how is she? How is Onyinbo land treating her?" "She is well." "And life as a second-class citizen in America?" "Chiaku, your sarcasm is unbecoming." "But it's true. All my years in Cambridge, I was a monkey who had developed the ability to reason. It is not that bad now." "That is what they tell you." "Every day our doctors go there and end up washing plates for Oyinbo, because Oyinbo doesn't think we study medicine right. Our lawyers go and drive taxis, because Oyinbo doesn't trust how we train them in law." Auntie Ephema cut in quickly, interrupting her friend. "I sent my CV to Philippa." Her friend brought the ends of her boo-boo together and tucked them in between her stretched-out legs. She looked out into the dark night, Her eyes narrowed, either in thought, or maybe in an attempt to figure exactly how far away the crickets were. "So, you too, Ephioma," she finally said. "It's not about me, Chiaku." Auntie Ephioma paused. "Who will teach Amaka and Obiora in university?" "The educated ones leave. The ones with the potential to right the wrongs. They leave the weak behind. The tyrants continue to reign because the weak cannot resist." "Do you not see that it's a cycle? Who will break that cycle?" "That's simply unrealistic pep rally nonsense, Auntie Chiaku," Obiora said. I saw the tension fall from the sky and envelop us all. A child's crying upstairs interrupted the silence. "Go into my room and wait for me, Obiora," Auntie Ephioma said. Obiora stood up and left. He looked grave, as if he'd only just realized what he had done. Auntie Ephioma apologized to her friend, but it was different after that. The insult of a child, a 14-year-old, hung between them, made their tongues heavy so that speech became a labor. Her friend left soon afterward, and Auntie Ephioma stormed inside, nearly knocking a lamp over. I heard the thud of a slap, and then her raised voice. "I don't quarrel with your disagreeing with my friend. I quarrel with how you have disagreed. I do not raise disrespectful children in this house. Do you hear me? You are not the only child who has skipped a class in school. I will not tolerate this rubbish from you. Inanu!" She lowered her voice then. I heard the click of her bedroom door closing. "I always got the stick on my palm," Amaka said, joining me on the veranda, "and Obiora got his on his buttocks. I think Mum felt giving it to me on my buttocks would somehow affect me, and maybe I would end up not growing breasts or something. I preferred the stick to her slaps, though, because her hand is made of metal. Eziokum." Amaka laughed. Afterward, we would talk about it for hours. I hated that. Just give me the lashes and let me out. But no, she explained why you had been flogged, what she expected you to do not to get flogged again. That's what she's doing with Obiora. I looked away. Amaka took my hand in hers. It felt warm, like the hand of someone just recovering from malaria. She didn't speak, but I felt as though we were thinking the same thing. How different it was for Jaja and me. I cleared my throat. Obiora must really want to leave Nigeria. He's stupid, Amaka said. She squeezed my hand tight before letting go. Auntie Ephioma was cleaning out the freezer, which had started to smell because of the incessant power outages. She wiped up the puddle of wine-coloured foul water that had leaked to the floor, and then brought out the bags of meat and laid them in a bowl. The tiny beef pieces had turned a mottled brown. The pieces of the chicken Jaja had killed had turned a deep yellow. "So much wasted meat," I said. Auntie Ephioma laughed. "Wasted? Quoi? I will boil it well with spices and cook away the spoilage." "Mom, she's talking like a big man's daughter," Amaka said, and I was grateful that she didn't sneer at me, that she echoed her mother's laughter instead. We were on the veranda, picking the stones out of rice. We sat on mats on the floor, beyond the shade, so we could feel the mild morning sun emerging after the rain. The dirty and clean rice were in 2 careful mounds on the enamel trays before us, with the stones placed on the mat. Amaka would divide the rice into smaller portions to blow the chaff out afterward. The problem with this kind of cheap rice is that it cooks into a pudding, no matter how little water you put in. You start to wonder if it's gari or rice that you're eating. Amaka muttered when Auntie Efeoma left. I smiled. I'd never felt the companionship I felt sitting next to her, listening to her Fela and Onyeka cassettes on the tiny tape player radio which she'd put batteries into. I'd never felt the comfortable silence we shared as we cleaned the rice carefully because the grains were stunted and sometimes looked like the glassy stones. Even the air seemed still, slowly rousing itself after the rain. The clouds were just starting to clear, like cotton wool tufts reluctantly letting go of one another. The sound of a car driving toward the flat disrupted our peace. I knew Father Amadi had office hours that morning at the chaplaincy, yet I still hoped it was him. I imagined him walking up to the veranda, holding his sultan in one hand so he could run up the short stairs, smiling. Amaka turned to look. "Auntie Beatrice!" I whipped around. Mama was climbing out of a yellow, unsteady-looking taxi. What was she doing here? What had happened? Why was she wearing her rubber slippers all the way from Enugu? She walked slowly, holding on to her wrapper that seemed so loose it would slip off her waist any minute. Her blouse didn't look ironed. "Mama? Ukini? Did something happen?" I asked, hugging her quickly so I could stand back and examine her face. Her hand was cold. Amaka hugged her and took her handbag. "Auntie Beatrice? No." Auntie Efeoma came hurrying out to the veranda, drying her hands in front of her shorts. She hugged Mama and then led her into the living room, supporting her as one would support a cripple. "Where is Jaja?" Mama asked. "He is out with Obiora," Auntie Efeoma said. "Sit down, Nwunyim. Amaka, get money from my purse and go and buy a soft drink for your auntie. Don't worry. I will drink water," Mama said. "We have not had light. The water will not be cold. It doesn't matter. I will drink it." Mama sat carefully at the edge of a cane chair. Her eyes were glazed over as she looked around. I knew she couldn't see the picture with the cracked frame, or the fresh African lilies in the oriental vase. "I don't know if my head is correct," she said, and pressed the back of her hand to her forehead in the way that one checks the degree of a fever. "I got back from the hospital today. The doctor told me to rest, but I took Eugene's money and asked Kevin to take me to the park. I hired a taxi and came here." "You were in hospital? What happened?" Auntie Efeoma asked quietly. Mama looked around the room. She stared at the wall clock for a while, the one with the broken second hand, before she turned to me. "You know that small table where we keep the family Bible, ne? Your father broke it on my belly." She sounded as if she were talking about someone else, as if the table were not made of sturdy wood. My blood finished on that floor even before he took me to St. Agnes. My doctor said there was nothing he could do to save it. Mama shook her head slowly. A thin line of tears crawled down her cheeks as though it had been a struggle for them to get out of her eyes. "To save it?" Auntie Efeoma whispered. What do you mean? I was 6 weeks gone. Cousina, don't say that again. Auntie Ephema's eyes widened. It's true. Eugene didn't know. I hadn't yet told him, but it's true. Mama slid down to the floor. She sat with her legs stretched out in front of her. It was so undignified. But I lowered myself and sat next to her, our shoulders touching. She cried for a long time. She cried until my hand, clasped in hers, felt stiff. She cried until Auntie Ephema finished cooking the rotting meat in a spicy stew. She cried until she fell asleep, her head against the seat of the chair. Jaja laid her on a mattress on the living room floor. Papa called that evening as we sat around the kerosene lamp on the veranda. Auntie Ephema answered the phone and came out to tell Mama who it was. I hung up. I told him I wouldn't let you come to the phone. Mama flew up from her stool. Why? Why? Nunjime, sit down right now, Auntie Ephema snapped. But Mama didn't sit down. She went into Auntie Ephema's room and called Papa. The phone rang shortly afterward, and I knew he'd called her back. She emerged from the room after about a quarter of an hour. We are leaving tomorrow, the children and I, she said, staring straight ahead, above everyone's eye level. Leaving for where? Auntie Ephema asked. Enugu. We're going back home. Has a nut come loose in your head, Bo? You're not going anywhere. Eugene is coming himself to pick us up. Listen to me. Auntie Ephema softened her voice. She must have known the firm voice wouldn't penetrate the fixed smile on Mama's face. Mama's eyes were still glazed, but she looked like a different woman from the one who had come out of the taxi that morning. She looked possessed by a different demon. At least stay a few days, Nunjim. Don't go back so soon. Mama shook her head. Except for the stiff stretch of her lips, she was expressionless. Eugene hasn't been well. He has been having migraines and fever, she said. He's carrying more than any man should carry. Do you know what Ade's death did to him? It is too much for one person. Kinidi, what are you saying? Auntie Ephema swiped impatiently at an insect that flew close to her ears. When Efiodora was alive, there were times, Nunjim, when the university didn't pay salaries for months. Efiodora and I had nothing, eh? Yet he never raised a hand to me. Do you know that Eugene pays the school fees of up to 100 of our people? Do you know how many people are alive because of your brother? That is not the point, and you know it. Where would I go if I leave Eugene's house? Tell me, where would I go? She didn't wait for Auntie Ephema to respond. Do you know how many mothers pushed their daughters at him? Do you know how many asked him to impregnate them even, and not to bother paying a bride price? And so? I ask you, and so? Auntie Ephema was shouting now. Mama lowered herself to the floor. Obiora had spread a mat, and there was room on it, but she sat on the bare cement, resting her head against the railings. You have come again with your university talk, Efioma, she said mildly, and then looked away to signal that the conversation was over. I'd never seen Mama like that. Never seen that look in her eyes. Never heard her say so much in such a short time. Long after she and Auntie Eferma had gone to bed, I sat on the veranda with Amaka and Obiora playing what? Obiora had taught me to play all the card games. "Last card," Amaka answered, smug, placing down a card. "I hope Auntie Beatrice sleeps well," Obiora said, picking up a card. "She should have taken a mattress. The mat is hard." "She'll be fine," Amaka said. She looked at me and repeated, "She'll be fine." Obiora reached out and patted my shoulder. I didn't know what to do, so I asked, "It's my turn?" even though I knew it was. "Uncle Eugene is not a bad man, really," Amaka said. "People have problems. People make mistakes." "Meh," Obiora said, pushing his glasses up. "I mean, some people can't deal with stress," Amaka said, looking at Obiora as though she expected him to say something. He remained silent, examining the card he held up to his face. Amaka picked up an extra card. "He paid for Papa Nuku's funeral, after all." She was still watching Obiora. But he made no response to her. Instead, he placed his card down and said, "Check up." He had won again. As I lay in bed, I didn't think about going back to Enugu. I thought about how many card games I'd lost. When Papa arrived in the Mercedes, Mama packed our bags herself and put them in the car. Papa hugged Mama, holding her close, and she rested her head on his chest. Papa had lost weight. Usually, Mama's small hands barely went round to his back, but this time her hands rested on the small of his back. I didn't notice the rashes on his face until I came close to hug him. They were like tiny pimples, each with whitish pus at the tips, and they covered the whole of his face, even his eyelids. His face looked swollen, oily, discoloured. I had intended to hug him and have him kiss my forehead, but instead I stood there and stared at his face. "I have a little allergy," he said. "Nothing serious." When he took me in his arms, I closed my eyes as he kissed my forehead. "We'll see you soon," Amaka whispered before we hugged goodbye. She called me Nwane Mwanyi, my sister. She stood outside the flat waving until I could no longer see her through the rear windscreen. When Papa started the rosary as we drove out of the compound, his voice was different, tired. I stared at the back of his neck, which wasn't covered by pimples, and it looked different too, smaller, with thinner folds of skin. I turned to look at Jaja. I wanted our eyes to meet so I could tell him how much I'd wanted to spend Easter in Nsukka, how much I'd wanted to attend Amaka's confirmation and Father Amadi's Paschal Mass, how I'd planned to sing, with my voice raised. But Jaja glued his eyes to the window, and except for muttering the prayers, he was silent until we got to Enugu. The scent of fruits filled my nose when Adamu opened our compound gates. It was as if the high walls locked in the scent of the ripening cashews and mangoes and avocados. It nauseated me. "See, the purple hibiscuses are about to bloom," Jaja said as we got out of the car. He was pointing, although I didn't need him to. I could see the sleepy oval-shaped buds in the front yard as they swayed in the evening breeze. The next day was Palm Sunday, the day Jaja didn't go to communion, the day Papa threw his heavy missile across the room and broke the figurines. The pieces